And my question is directed to any three of you. My question is that in this day of age, is there anybody that had the same role as the one that Caesar had, and like they're still going for rights and that we're all treated equally?
I have one here. I think these two individuals here, you know, Yvanna Cancela, who's involved in the labor justice movement here in Southern Nevada, is very reminiscent of a Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta out there working in the fields, organizing peoples, oftentimes people who are not making as much, who want to have a shot at a better standard of living or a lifestyle, or even Jose, who's out there every day getting people registered to vote, as Vili Velasquez was very famous for. You know, the simple notion there that if you register people to vote, get them prepared to participate in elections, that's how you empower people. So I think we have two people right over here in front of you today.
And I would say that Reuben's being very humble and excluding himself from being a tremendous leader. I think what he does in the classroom every day really empowers the next generation of leaders, and it speaks to, I think, a difference in time, in that Cesar Chavez really became the leader and the model at the time when there was much less media, and it's not in any way to downplay his leadership, but today there are so many people who are active every day in putting in their piece of sand and moving the grain of sand that's before them in order to make their piece of the world better. And so it's hard to point to just one person who's really leading a movement. There are thousands of leaders across the country who are organizing in their communities, registering folks to vote, teaching people the tools to lobby their local elected officials, teaching others about those who came before them. And all of that work is what leads to collective justice.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Catherine Rayner. I'm the city clerk for the city of North Las Vegas. And this is more a point of conversation than an actual question. As a clerk, I firmly believe that number one, registering to vote is so important. Sadly, on the other hand, I realize that in my city, for one, locally other cities as well, have very few registered voters, and of the registered voters, even fewer actually vote when it comes time for the election. So to me, registering to vote and education of our youth and the workforce as a whole are two ways of improving anything for any race. And so I just want to know how you are going to encourage others. I realize that there are people out there doing things, but at our council meeting recently, we heard a lecture from the Lindsay Institute about how they're going to change the Clark County School District, because it's the 5th largest school district in the United States. Mm-hmm. And talking about gerrymandering, you know, it looks like all sorts of ways they could divide it up. So I think that we need to figure out different ways to empower the people to express their voice. So what suggestions do you have to those people who seem to be, as far as I can see, quite passive and not part of the process?
Las Vegas has a unique set of challenges, and probably every city will say this, but Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, in that we are a very transient area. Right, we get folks from all over the country, from all over the world, who come here, stick around for a bit, and then move along. We have a lot of folks who come here and don't even register to vote in the state, but keep their registration from wherever their home state is. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole set of challenges. And I think what needs to happen, and what I think happens every 4 years during the big presidential elections, is a massive push to get as many people as possible registered to vote. And it happens from both sides of the political spectrum. Unfortunately, once the presidential cycle is over, a lot of that dissipates. A lot of the funding goes away, a lot of the staff that does the work goes away, and then we get in time, you know, we come into our municipal election time, and the amount of people who vote in our municipal elections is frankly pathetic. It's very, very low. And even now we just had primary elections. Less than 20% of all people who are registered to vote came out to vote in a primary election in a presidential year. And so I think there are three things that really have to happen. One is an ongoing push by all organizations that have access to more than 2 people, I mean just at every level, to encourage voter registration. And we're very fortunate in Clark County in particular to have online voter registration, and it's just so easy to register.
But there's a big difference between registering and actually voting.
Right. And that's where, and frankly, if you don't vote in Clark County, it's because you don't want to vote. You have 14 days of early voting plus election day, and you can vote in grocery stores, malls. It's incredibly easy. And so there has to be a real systematic organizing drive on behalf of organizations and individuals that says that voting matters. And it doesn't just matter because of who you elect. It matters because it's something that people fought and died for decades. It is not just it is not something that we can take for granted or take lightly. And it's something that millions of people in this country wish that they could do. And we become the voices for folks who can't vote. And we become the voices for ourselves. And it's not just voting, it's voting in an informed way so that you elect people who represent you and your values. And it's having those conversations all the time, whether it's with our friends, our coworkers, our kids, and making sure that as many people as possible that we can communicate with know just how important and how easy it is to vote.
And just to add on to that, sometimes taking the easy way to vote is actually probably not the best approach. Sometimes the physical act of going to a poll with your son or your daughter and showing them the process, so that that's a positive that they can replicate when they become of age to vote.
Right.
That's all I have.
I would just like to ask, especially from all of you on the panel, being very young, very accomplished, I know you work with youth in the community a lot. I just really curious to see the youth today that you work with. Do they really have an appreciation of the struggles that went before in the time of like Cesar Chavez and the different groups that came up? Are they complacent in a regard? Do they, it seems like with the technology that we have, life seems to be a little bit easier. We get the schools, we don't have to struggle with the segregation that we used to in that regard. Is it a little bit difficult when you approach some of these subjects and try to talk about the history or where it came up from to get a response from? I'm very curious to see what kind of the average response is from youth today in the community that is affected by that.
I guess the high school history teacher here can take the first shot at this. I think I'm optimistic. Oftentimes you hear, oh, the youth of today are, not the way they were, or they're lazy, or they're not as involved. But I think they're one of the most connected, most informed generations in the history of mankind. I mean, as a teacher, I'm always telling them to get off their phone in class, but it's usually because they're engaging with somebody else or reading, a blog or something. And just this constant communication that they're having with one another keeps them informed. If those of you who are familiar with social media know that when you get on Facebook, you actually get news feeds on there too about what's going on in the world. So you know what's happening. Like that's how I found out about the Supreme Court decisions this morning. First thing I wake up, look at my phone. Oh man, that's serious. And these young people, that's something that they're hardwired to do. This is something that they've had with them all their lives. So I'm optimistic. I think, but I do think that again, and this is something that I've had many discussions with other young people my age, millennials and whatever the generation after, the perennials or whatever they call them, the preteens, is that we haven't really had, and there's some communities that this, and I'll address this in a second, where we haven't had something very dear taken away from us. The 60s generations, they were fighting for the right to vote. We had to pass massive legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, to empower these communities. You see 18-year-olds in the Vietnam War saying, hey, if I'm going out to war, if I can die for my country, can I at least vote for my congressman or my the president? And we have a constitutional amendment in the early 70s that changed the voting age from 21 to 18. You see this. You see women asking for greater equality. In the workforce, in society. And as an immigrant, and I'll say this, and this is something that I do see a difference with our kids today. Many of the individuals who are come from communities of color and who maybe who are born citizens, you know, they seem to be the ones who just don't understand. And maybe this is because they're coming from a point of privilege, like I know I can vote. And I see some of my students who are not, and I was a naturalized citizen. I was always paying attention to politics. I loved history. I was a history major, but I couldn't participate. This is something that I didn't have, you know. And I fought in the Iraq War. You know, I went out there literally to help. You know, this was some of the language that was spoken at the time, to help bring the ability to vote to some of these people there. Not have a dictator in place anymore. Have a more democratic society. And I remember seeing those people with the black fingers there. You know, that's how they vote over there, with the ink on their fingers. So I'm like, hey, I can't even go back to my country. I'm over here fighting for these people, but I can't vote when I go back home. And I became naturalized after my deployment. And it's something that I do religiously. You know, I go and vote in every single election. I participate. I was upset one time because the county didn't send me my absentee ballot. And I mean, it was like a cardinal sin. Like, how dare they not, you know, send that absentee ballot to me while I was out of state for an election. And again, it was because it was taken away from me. So I think that's something that we can look at here. Until our generation finds out a real need, and we coalesce around those needs, you know, then we'll see. Then I think we can be much more aware. We can become awakened. You know, that's the term that I would use, because we see that awakening with the Chicano movement in the 40s, in the 50s, and the 60s. The same thing with the African American movement. You know, fighting in a war, and you know, to bring democracy and freedom to Europe or East Asia, and then coming home and being treated as a second-class citizen. That was the real moment, I think, that really opened up this era of civil rights. And it's again because you now are awakened to the fact that you didn't have something, and now you're going to coalesce around it, this movement, and fight to achieve it. That's my take on it, at least.